sometimes it's difficult to figure out who's the best and who's the worst, who had the best draft, who had the worst draft in the NFL draft. I'll tell you this much. If you were looking for surprises, if you're looking for a little bit of drama, congratulations. You came to the right place. Guys, welcome to the show. Good to be with you. Brought to you by Americans for Prosperity, AmericansForProsperity.org, economic liberty and free speech. Money is getting spent, and I'm not just talking about what the Baltimore Ravens did in keeping Lamar Jackson, because I don't think they necessarily had an option. What was it, $187 million in guaranteed money? It's all just nuts. There he is, the man himself, JMV from 93.5, 107.5, The Fan, the voice of sports in Indiana. We should get into the Lamar Jackson thing because there's a great story there as a lesson for the idea of whether or not anybody can get full-on guaranteed money and how much the Jalen Hurts contract affected the Lamar Jackson contract. But walk me through the first two picks of this draft, because they're the only two picks that went according to plan. Bryce Young of Alabama going to the Panthers, and then C.J. Stroud of Ohio State going to the Texans.
Yeah, and then what happened was Houston kind of blew it up a little bit, right? I mean, they really went out and, we've heard this past couple of years about the all chips in with Jim Irsay here in Indy, but I think you saw Houston do just that in this draft last night in the first round, because they went out and got, again, arguably the second best quarterback available in the draft, with C.J. Stroud, while the whole month, Tony, leading up to this draft, everybody maintained nationally that Houston would not select a quarterback. They would go defense. So they go with C.J. Stroud, and then they trade back in and get the best defensive player in the draft, and that is Will Anderson. So you look at the top of the list of things that went right, teams that did well. You start with Houston. You factor in Philadelphia, who just continues to draft Georgia Bulldog defensive players. I mean, you talk about Carter and Smith, two defensive guys that have been outstanding in their careers in Athens, Georgia. That was huge for Philadelphia in round number one, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in just a second. But, yeah, the Colts, some shockwaves to a degree as well with Anthony Richardson.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into that. But, you talk about how the Texans blew it up, right? Mm-hmm. If we were to argue, JMV, who won this draft, is it the Texans by being able to trade up to that number 3 pick? It was the Cardinals who had that. They dropped down to eventually what is a number 6 in a whole trade with the Lions, I believe it was, and be able to pick up not only a quarterback for the future in C.J. Stroud, but a guy who arguably it was either him or Jalen Carter and Will Anderson Jr. as the best defensive player, or maybe the best athlete on the entire board.
Yeah, Tony, they improved their top 11 yesterday, and that's a big deal. And in terms of you're saying, well, what do you mean about improving the top 11? I'm not talking about the 11 starters. I'm talking about, in this case, you've got a team, you're looking for defining members of the team in specialty positions. For example, quarterback is certainly, Tony, at the top of that list, and so is an edge rusher. This is where the Colts have to get back to, because Chris Ballard had consistently over the years talked about the level in which you wanted to get this team in terms of depth. Well, now you sit there and they don't have a lot of depth, and you sit there and you look at these frontline guys in the most important defining positions, Tony, in the NFL. They really haven't had that covered either. So that was defining for the Texans in getting back on track. I thought they had an excellent draft. And, when we get to the Colts, it'll be argued, it'll be criticized. I'm not sure. I found it really hard to have much really issue-wise with what Chris Ballard did and what Shane Steichen did at quarterback, and going number 4 overall with Richardson. So
let's talk about that. Anthony Richardson right there, number 4 from the University of Florida, going to the Indianapolis Colts. You're talking about a guy who has a season under his belt, 13 games, JMV. Under his belt, 57% with the completions, but he does have 12 touchdowns rushing with over 1,000 yards on the ground. And as you have described and others have described, this is a generational athletic talent that the new coach, Shane Steichen, and the general manager, Chris Ballard, believe they can develop to be their quarterback of the future. And we should be clear, when it comes to the Colts, their first-round picks as quarterbacks are Peyton Manning and Andrew Luck in this modern era. They've had some good luck when they get to pick.
Well, and they've held the number one overall selection in those examples too. And this was different. This was a number 4. But getting back to both Chris Ballard and Shane Steichen, I think the thing I like the best about this is, to me, it's clear that Chris Ballard and Jim Irsay, even the owner, let Shane Steichen make that final decision. I mean, maybe it wasn't an all together, hey, this is on him, he's going to make this pick. But I think that he had a little bit more say in exactly, Tony, the style of quarterback, the type of quarterback that he wanted to try to bring along. And make no mistake, that's exactly why he got signed to a 6-year deal. That's their expectation. At the top of his resume coming from Philly as the offensive coordinator was he developed quarterbacks at a very high, an elite level. Phillip Rivers, who was already well down the road, but he coached him up. He coached up Justin Herbert at the early stages, and you saw what he did with Jalen Hurts this past year. So that is job number 1 for Shane Steichen. And I love the fact that it appears that the Colts, Ballard and Irsay, let him have ultimately what he wanted. Let's get back to something else you pointed out. This is the best athlete, Tony, in the history of the quarterback position entering the draft. Make no mistake about that. That's a big deal. I don't know if he can play quarterback. I don't think any of us know through 13 games at Florida whether or not he can play quarterback at the NFL level, but he is absolutely the most athletically gifted quarterback to ever enter the NFL. That's what we're looking at with Anthony Richardson.
Let me move off that and get some other weird things that took place in this draft. And I want to jump it down to the number 12 pick. This was the Colts. Not the Colts, I'm sorry, the Lions, who picked this up, and that whole move with Arizona, the whole thing comes from Cleveland, the moves with Arizona and Houston, and they pick up Jahmyr Gibbs out of Alabama. And I don't think he was necessarily on anybody's radar this early in the draft, but you watch the GM, right? Brad Holmes, you watch the coach, Dan Campbell, after that pick, you would have thought somebody had brought them cake and ice cream and handed them checks and said, all your wishes have come true. The 2 happiest guys in America. The Lions already have 2 running backs. What's the point here?
Well, I mean, that's how and the style in which Dan Campbell wants to play, for one. And getting back to the point you made about being happy and serve cake and all that, all these guys do it. Every draft room, after they make a pick, they act like they got exactly what they want. Now, it's funny, before the draft, it seems like nobody knows anything. Well, I don't know where this team is going in front of us. We're going to have to respond to, we're going to have to let the board talk to us, or whatever BS that is. These guys know exactly what's going to be available, exactly what's going to be done, I think. Now, maybe there was a little bit of question at number 4 as to whether or not Anthony Richardson was going to be there for the Colts, but I maintain that they were in control and knew that. That's why they're so comfortable in staying at number 4. But getting back to your Lions point, so they go defense with Campbell, and they also go offense at running back with Gibbs. I think that's just the way that Dan Campbell wants to play, the head coach. I think that kind of falls in line with what he wants. It sounds like that he had a great deal of input with Holmes, the general manager, and himself about the direction he wanted to continue to take this team. Because you could argue, Tony, you could argue that if you're talking about Will Levis, who was that quarterback that's still on the board in round number 2 as of right now, you could talk about with Jared Goff as the starter, maybe you should go ahead and start the clock on trying to bring somebody along as a future quarterback. They decided not to do that, and they went running back and they went linebacker in that draft because I think Dan Campbell, that's the style of which he wants to play.
Let's talk about it. Talking to JMV from 93.5, 107.5, The Fan in Indianapolis, the voice of sports in the state of Indiana. Will Levis, University of Kentucky. I mean, the imagery of him sitting there at the draft, Big Blue Bud on Twitter putting out brutal and unfair, man. Will Levis simply doesn't deserve this. The comeback story is going to go crazy, and it's just pictures of Will Levis just in a state of shock. I don't know if he's being hugged by his mom or his girlfriend, whatever the case may be there. But I got to tell you, JMV, he doesn't get picked in those first 4. It's Bryce Young, it's CJ Stroud, it's Anthony Richardson, and all of a sudden he's on the drop into the second round. Is this a conversation about Will Levis not having the skills and it being all hype? Or is this a conversation about he just didn't fit those first 3 teams, but he's still an excellent quarterback? There just wasn't a quarterback need like there may have been in other drafts.
Tony, you may have seen the dynamic. Let's just say we flip the roles here. Levis goes to the Colts. You may have seen Richardson drop a little bit, but he wouldn't have dropped all the way out in the first round into the second round. I still think that maybe, the Raiders would have taken a shot, and maybe the Buccaneers would have taken a chance, or even maybe somebody would have traded back in at the end of round number 1 to secure Richardson. That's just the difference between what people believe the upside is, and it's a whole athletic dynamic going on here. But with Levis, I'm going to root for the guy because I think this is something people will suggest that he's a guy that plays off of emotion. He's a guy that wears, all of his thoughts on his sleeve. And when you get undersold in front of America, as he did last night, there is no better motivational chip out there. And then in part, there was supposed an injury to a toe that people were skeptical about and maybe a little bit scared away from. But I would bet on this guy. I'd bet on this guy if he's a selection in round number 2, which is an assumption here that he goes someplace, and it's going to benefit him to have that motivational chip on his shoulder for the embarrassment that he had to go through last night. And by the way, too, family members or not, the guy was lucky. He was surrounded by nothing but chicks last night, Tony. That's pretty sweet. Family members, girlfriend. Looked like he was in a pretty good spot for me. He's still going to make a boatload of cash. But, yes, for a competitor like that, there's no doubt. It's embarrassing, but I think it's going to do him a service to be even better than people thought because so many people last night passed on him. He's going to want to make these people pay. That's a great motivational chip that you have going into the NFL, Tony.
You got to assume, because I looked at him and I'm like, somebody, he's going to get on a team and somebody's going to try and Ryan Leaf this dude. Some reporter's going to try and get under his skin, try and make him crack, and he all falls apart. He wasn't the number 1. He drops. He couldn't handle that was the look when I saw him. Yeah. That was the feel I got. But that's about me having a bit of disdain for.
We've been through that before too. I mean, Aaron Rodgers sat there for a long time. If you remember, Lamar Jackson sat there for a long time in the green room waiting too. So there are good stories of quarterbacks certainly being very good once they go through that into the NFL, and I think that's what's going to happen to Will Levis as well. At least I'm hoping for.
Let us break it down. Yeah. Who won this draft? What's the team that walks away the winner?
I'll give you 2 right here, Tony. I think the Texans, we already talked about the Texans a little bit, too, what they did at the very top. I mean, you got 2 incredible talents, one the best defensive player in the draft, and the second best quarterback, second best offensive player in the draft is what they got at the very top. That's incredible to me. And again, what Philadelphia did, Philadelphia's just reloading defensively. They've already got a number of Georgia former defensive players.
Jalen Carter, man.
You get Jalen Carter.
People are like that's somehow like not a top story. That's a monster get.
Monster guy. I mean, he's a guy that, had some situations, some red flags arise and fell a little bit. Probably would have gone much higher. Maybe would have gone much higher. But the fact they got him and Nolan Smith from Georgia defensively to fortify a defense that's already talented as anybody else, that is a huge win. That might even be better considering, Tony, where Philly is right now, coming off participation in the Super Bowl. For them, that might even be bigger than ultimately the Houston thing, just living in the now with what they did to fortify that defense.
Yeah, I'm very much there that what the Texans did in the move up to getting pick 3 is splash. But if we're talking about results, it's amazing what you could do in a draft, JMV, when you already have a quarterback like Jalen Hurts. You're already set. You're not searching for those pieces. You can really fortify. Now the question is, who lost this thing? Who in round 1 didn't deliver and took the pick that made you say, what the hell is this?
Probably, and maybe this is because how you look at the running back position and how devalued, Tony, it has been over the past decade plus. Maybe Bijan Robinson out of Texas going to Atlanta was
number 8
of a surprise. Yeah, that was a surprise. And really, this is just me, and I guess an indictment on running backs right now. You brought up Gibbs a little bit earlier. And I know that's the style, and I defended that in Dan Campbell, but maybe that wasn't the play either right there. So I think you could argue either the Lions or the Falcons going with running backs. And I can tell you this, Robinson sounds like an absolute gas. He sounds like a dude I can listen to all day long. And in terms of comparisons, he's supposed to be one of the best running backs we have ever seen come out of the draft in the past 10 or so years. So, if he's better than what we have seen in the good days with a guy like Jonathan Taylor here locally, that would be outstanding. But, yeah, I would probably look at the running back position just in terms of value and where you may have in terms of Detroit being able to get somebody like Gibbs a little bit later on. I'd probably argue that. Not a lot, though, because they ultimately got what they wanted in the draft, and that's the criteria here.
Before I let you go, man, Lamar Jackson sticking with the Ravens, that $187 million guaranteed. That's still a tremendous amount of money, but we've now set the stage, man. The idea of the fully guaranteed contract is over. No one's trying it again.
No, I don't think so either. But it's going to be something like this. And really, you kind of look back on it now, we wonder whether or not he needed representation. And as, it panned out, he didn't need representation. And Jalen Hurts kind of set the market for him, so he knew exactly where he wanted to go. And then, Eric DeCosta and company in Baltimore knew exactly where they wanted to go. And we just knew all the time this was ultimately going to get worked out because Baltimore, as you mentioned earlier, and rightly so, just had no other direction to go. And by the way, speaking of the draft, they draft wide receiver in the slot. Very quick, very athletic. Zay Flowers out of Boston College. So that makes the quarterback you just re-up for all that money feel really good. You bring in Odell Beckham Jr. That has to make him feel really good. This has been a team and a quarterback that has dealt with not a lot of talent at the skill positions at wide receiver in Baltimore. And certainly in the past month or so, and certainly last night, they got a lot better.
And as we discuss Anthony Richardson, there comes a moment where you can't have your quarterback just be the mobile quarterback. They got to have places to throw the ball. And that's clearly what the Ravens have given Lamar Jackson. JMV from 93.5, 107.5, The Fan in Indianapolis. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us, and I appreciate you guys watching. That's right. It's more than just the politics, people. There's a big world out there. Might as well enjoy yourself a little bit. So don't forget to subscribe on Rumble, and my thanks to Americans for Prosperity, sponsoring everything I do. AFP, AmericansForProsperity.org, economic liberty and free speech. And guys, subscribe. It's good for you. It builds character. And I'll catch you tomorrow.